George, I'm so excited to be here and talk to you. It's a massive, massive passion of mine, rewilding. And of course, rewilding is a fairly new word, isn't it? How would you sum up rewilding the best?
Well, even though it's a new word, there are already lots of definitions, but the two which I like best are the mass restoration of ecosystems, bringing back life, plants and animals from places where they're missing, and also the rewilding of ourselves, the finding in our lives a more exciting and thrilling way of living and engaging with the world than we often do at the moment.
I'd like to talk to you now about the reintroduction of certain species to Britain, which of course, as you know, I would love to see. But the question that just bugs me, which I'm sure everybody else constantly asks you, is England ready for these animals? Because I'd love to see wolves coming back, but right now I'm just thinking, if we took a wolf, we plopped it down in Scotland, or like a pack of wolves in Scotland, is the environment ready for the wolves? Or by putting the wolves into that environment, would they change the environment the moment they touched down? Or is it far more complicated than that? Do we have to build from the bottom up before we put the wolves in? Or do we put the wolves in and allow them to change the environment?
Well, the first thing to say is that wolves are incredibly adaptable and resilient creatures. They can pretty well live anywhere. I mean, they do live all the way from the Arctic Circle to the tropics. It's an incredible range of habitats that they occupy. And wolves would be perfectly happy raiding dustbins in London. That's not the ideal situation, and I'm not proposing that we reintroduce wolves to London so that they can live that way. So basically, it's not an ecological constraint, it's a political constraint that we're up against. It's are people prepared for wolves? Even our trashed habitat in this country is prepared for wolves. There's loads of wild deer here, in fact too many deer because there are no predators to keep them in check. And it's very hard often to establish a new woodland because the deer eat all the saplings just like sheep do. They all love baby trees. They're very tasty. They're full of nutrition. And so in a way, I'd say we actually need wolves and lynx to bring back some ecological balance. And what we discover very quickly is that wolves in particular are crucial ecosystem engineers because they trigger what are called trophic cascades. Now, everyone knows what a cascade is, a waterfall. Trophic means to do with feeding, eating and being eaten. And in the old days, back in the Jurassic, when I studied zoology at university, we were basically taught that ecosystems were regulated from the bottom up. You have a particular climate, a particular soil type, that gives rise to a particular vegetation, which then supports a particular population of herbivores, which then supports a particular population of carnivores. Well, we now know in place after place around the world that they're often controlled from the top down, that the carnivores are absolutely crucial in determining the health of the ecosystem. So wolves, for example, they will not only suppress the populations of deer and other large herbivores, but they will also move them around. The deer will avoid certain areas where they can easily be ambushed and caught. They will concentrate in other areas, and this creates a habitat mosaic. So some areas have quite heavy grazing, other areas are released from grazing and the trees start to return. And when the trees return, loads of other species return with the trees, the migratory birds, the beavers around the rivers because they need trees, and the beavers then create dams. They're ecosystem engineers too, and so the otters move in and the water birds move in and the fish move in and the rest of it. The wolves, by leaving bits of the carcasses of the deer they kill out, then create opportunities for scavenging birds and scavenging mammals. Wolves suppress fox populations, and as a result you'll see more rodents, and then that leads to more weasels and more stoats and other smaller predators. And it turns out they affect everything, even down to the soil type, because by concentrating in some areas and avoiding others, the herbivores will change the nutrient composition of the soil. They even, according to some evidence, will affect the shape of rivers, because by allowing vegetation to grow around riverbanks once more, they stabilise the riverbanks and change the structure of the rivers. You get a far more diverse structure of pools and riffle sections and the rest of it than you had before. So it turns out that predators like wolves, but also many other predators and many other habitats, are absolutely crucial for the functioning of the whole system. So if you were to start with somewhere like the Scottish Highlands, you've got a pretty wrecked environment there as a result of sheep and very high levels of deer who are maintained by the stalking estates, so that a banker waddling up a hillside in +4s can pretty well fire a gun over his shoulder and shoot a deer. There's so blinking many of them, and they call it sport. You've got this really quite trashed ecosystem, but it would be very good for supporting wolves. You know, plenty of deer to eat, and wolves love deer. They'll hunt them ahead of anything else. But by reintroducing the wolves, if you allow them to prosper, then you start to repair that broken ecosystem. And you know, this is one of the reasons to me why it's such an attractive option.
So let's talk about sheep farming. Because, of course, in Scotland, we have a lot of sheep. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is, if we put the wolves in Scotland, won't they just eat the sheep and ignore the deer? How do we tackle this problem?
Well, there's no question that wolves and sheep farming are not the perfect neighbours. They're not ideally compatible. But it's not as bad as most people imagine, because for some reason we're not completely sure of, wolves don't like eating sheep that much. They much prefer deer. Given the choice, they will go for deer rather than sheep. Could be that they don't like digging through all that wool in order to get to the meat. We're not quite sure, but it's a strange thing, because sheep are easier to catch, but they will prefer to put the extra effort into chasing the deer instead. But there will be clashes. There will be cases where sheep are killed, and farmers should be compensated for that. Ideally, we would see farmers joining in and benefiting from this by being paid to help look after the wolves and to help restore habitats and ecosystems and stop flooding downstream and store carbon in the soil and all the rest of it. But you know, there will be clashes, and what is absolutely essential is that the active consent and the engagement of communities is part of this, is the actual first step of any of this. If you try to impose it on people and say you're having it whether you like it or not, that is just a formula for disaster. The wolves will be shot, you'll just get a lot of very angry people, you'll get politicians voted out of office. It's not going to work for anyone. This is something where we have to ensure that people are on our side with it and that people actually want it. And that involves a lot of the key decision makers and landowners in the countryside, as well as the general population. And so we have to show people that it's in their own interests, that this is going to work for them economically and spiritually as well, but you know, that it's actually going to put food on their tables, and ideally more than the current system does, which is incredibly loss-making right across the board, so that we actually make sure that people are the willing hosts of the wolves, because ideally that's what we need. And it's no good just saying, oh, we'll buy up the land and fence it off and put wolves in there. That just makes people hostile. You've got to work with communities, not against them. That's absolutely crucial, I think.
Another thing with wolves, as we know, is wolves are very, very successful predators, and once they get going, they can breed quite efficiently. And they don't live with one another. Once they get to a certain mature age, then the males of the pack are going to be forced to move on and make their own packs. Of course, this will mean that the wolves will split and they will grow, and the territories will split and they will grow. Scotland is only so big, and it is a beautiful wilderness, and it is ideal for them to be there. But we know that the wolves will not stay there, that eventually packs will split and they will break, and it will mean that the wolves will start to walk into other areas, and you're going to get lone wolves that probably will walk into the outskirts of towns and cities as the packs establish themselves across the UK. We're talking about getting people on our side. Are wolves going to have to be managed? If we bring them back to the UK, I know a lot of people don't want to see this, and of course one argument against not bringing them back is the fact that everyone is just going to go and shoot them, because people go and shoot foxes, people are now shooting badgers. Everything they can possibly do, they will kill if they're scared of them, or as you were saying, if they're pests or they're hunting animals that we farm. Is this the reality of rewilding if wolves come back, that they will have to be managed?
There's no question that we have a broken and fearful relationship with wildlife in this country. We are biophobic, zoophobic. We are really, really scared of animals to almost a ridiculous degree, and more so than the great majority of countries around the world, because we've lived almost without animals for so long. So definitely we have to assure people that there's going to be limits, and that our relationship with wolves is going to have to be regulated. We can't just leave it to nature and see what happens, because people won't put up with that. As I say, the constraints are political, not ecological. So I think what we need to do as a nation is to make a democratic decision about what our relationship with wolves should be. Are we going to have them? I hope the answer is yes. I hope very much so. And if the answer is yes, where are we going to have them, and what are going to be the limits of that relationship? The geographical limits, but also the social limits in terms of our interaction with them, and what we are prepared to put up with and what we're not prepared to put up with, and what we see as wonderful flourishing of nature and what we might see as a more threatening side of it. And so, having made those democratic decisions, with people's proper, informed and engaged consent, we then have to say, okay, well, then there are going to be lines beyond which, if the wolves stray, we'll have to get them back, relocate them, move them to another part of Europe where they might need wolves to rewild, or whatever that might mean. And that might mean, well, there's various technologies for sort of trying to push wolves back into the territory where we want them, or it could mean tranquilizing them and moving them with a vehicle. So we just have to be open to the realization that these are fraught political decisions, and they have to be made, as all political decisions should be, which is democratically.
If you had to make a decision, you had to say, is it better to have them back anyway, regardless of if they cull them, or not have them at all? What would you pick? Because having them back will create your trophic cascade. It will help the environment. Do we look at the environment as a whole and we just say this is something wolves will just have to suffer in order to build that ecosystem that we so desperately need? Or do we turn around and say, no, it's not kind to do that, because they will suffer greatly, they'll be shot incorrectly. As we know, they always shoot alpha wolves, leaders of the pack, that disperse the pack. You get lone wolves, they end up going into towns and cities, makes the whole thing worse. If you had to make a choice, would you pick the environment, or would you pick the welfare of the wolf?
Well, this is a really interesting and important question. My feeling is that, look, there's always going to be tensions. It is always going to be difficult. Nothing worth doing is easy. If we only did the easy things, and we only did the things where there wasn't any inherent conflict, we would lead very dull lives indeed, and nothing would ever improve, and nothing would ever change, and the rich and powerful people would still run our lives in every single detail, and we would basically be slaves. And so we have to grasp difficult and complex and knotty decisions, and we have to engage with really hard things to implement. And my answer to your question is, I would go for reintroducing the wolves, even though it's going to be tough, both for the people who are doing it and possibly for the wolves, for the reasons that you state. But it has to be alongside not just the broad democratic consent, but also really good information, so that people see what a wonderful, amazing creature we're talking about. It's not just something out of a Red Riding Hood story, and we look at all those stories which are just so amazingly prejudiced against the wolf. I want to write stories where the sheep's a villain and the wolf is a hero, because that's how I see it in ecological terms. And in fact, the sheep has wiped out almost all wildlife. Why should the sheep be allowed to wipe out almost all wildlife? It's killed far more wildlife than wolves have ever killed. I'd like to sort of turn that round with good public information. But of course there will be tension and there will be conflict, and some wolves will be shot, often by complete idiots. But then that's the same with all wildlife, and if we were to say we must avoid any wildlife being shot by idiots, well, then that would mean there'd be no wildlife at all, because there's hardly a species bigger than a field vole which doesn't get shot by idiots. And we would have to wipe out all wildlife for the benefit of wildlife. Well, I think for the benefit of wolves, we should allow wolves to live, and we should allow wolves to occupy places where they can happily occupy. And then we confront the idiotic tendency to shoot them with really good information and outreach and engagement and intelligent discussion, which even in Britain we are capable of.
Well, George, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and I've learned so much, and it's been wonderful to hear about your passion with rewilding, and I share your vision of the future, and I really, really hope that one day that we can see a much greener and more forested Great Britain.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah.